Welcome to English Listening with Mai. This channel is designed to help improve your listening, vocabulary, and understanding of natural English through calm stories and everyday conversations. Today's story begins at a train station where a traveler notices an old suitcase that seems to have been everywhere. But the real story is not the suitcase. It's the person carrying it. Let's begin. The central train station was always busy in the late afternoon. Travelers moved quickly through the large hall. Some pulled rolling suitcases behind them. Others carried backpacks or large travel bags. Announcements echoed through the station speakers. Trains arriving, trains departing, passengers rushing toward the correct platform. Among the crowd stood a young man named Leo Carter. Leo was 26 years old and worked as a photographer. His job allowed him to travel often, sometimes for work, sometimes simply for adventure. That afternoon, Leo waited for a train heading north to a small coastal town. He planned to spend the weekend taking photos of the ocean and nearby cliffs. While waiting for the train, Leo sat on a wooden bench near the platform. He placed his camera bag beside him and watched the busy station. Travelers fascinated him. Every person seemed to be heading somewhere important: a business meeting, a family visit, a vacation, or perhaps the beginning of something new. As Leo observed the crowd, one person caught his attention. An older man slowly walked through the station carrying a large brown suitcase. The suitcase looked very old. The leather was faded, the corners were worn, and the surface was covered with colorful travel stickers. Some stickers were faded and almost unreadable. Others showed the names of cities from around the world: Lisbon, Tokyo, Buenos Aires, Cape Town. Leo leaned forward slightly. He had never seen a suitcase like that before. Most modern luggage looked identical, plain, practical, but this suitcase looked like a map of someone's life. The older man stopped near the same bench and gently set the suitcase down. He sat beside Leo and wiped his glasses with a small cloth. Leo tried not to stare at the suitcase too obviously, but his curiosity grew stronger every second. Finally, he couldn't resist asking, "That suitcase has traveled a lot," Leo said politely. The older man looked down at it and smiled. "Yes," he said, "it certainly has." Leo pointed at one of the stickers. "Is that from Argentina?" The man nodded. "Buenos Aires." That was a very long trip. Leo looked at another sticker. "And this one? Japan?" "Yes," the man said. "Tokyo." Leo shook his head in amazement. "That's incredible." The man chuckled softly. "It's been with me for many years." Leo smiled. "You must travel a lot." The man looked thoughtful. "I used to." "Not as much anymore." Leo tilted his head. "What did you do?" The man closed the suitcase gently and rested his hand on top of it. "For most of my life," he said slowly, "I collected stories." Leo raised his eyebrows. "You mean you were a writer?" The man smiled faintly. "Something like that." Leo leaned back on the bench. Now his curiosity was even stronger, because anyone whose suitcase had traveled the world probably had some very interesting stories to tell. The station announcement echoed through the hall again. A train arrived on the far platform. People moved quickly around Leo and the older man, but neither of them seemed to notice the rush of travelers anymore. Leo's attention was fixed on the suitcase, and the man sitting beside it. "You said you collected stories," Leo said. "What does that mean exactly?" The older man smiled and leaned back slightly on the bench. "My name is Daniel Mercer," he said. "Nice to meet you." "Leo Carter," Leo replied. Daniel nodded toward Leo's camera bag. "You're a photographer." Leo laughed quietly. "Is it that obvious?" Daniel pointed to the lens peeking out of the bag. "Photographers and travelers usually recognize each other." Leo nodded. "That's true." Daniel rested both hands on the suitcase. "For most of my life, I worked as a travel journalist," he explained. "My job was to visit different places around the world and write about them." Leo's eyes widened slightly. "That sounds like the best job in the world." Daniel smiled. "It felt that way sometimes. But traveling also teaches you something very important." Leo leaned forward. "What's that?" Daniel tapped the suitcase gently. "The most interesting stories are never about the places." Leo frowned slightly. "They're not?" Daniel shook his head. "No. They're about the people you meet there." Leo considered that for a moment. He realized that many of his favorite photographs were not landscapes. They were portraits, faces, moments, people. "So every sticker on your suitcase is connected to a story?" Leo asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, every single one." Leo studied the suitcase again. The stickers suddenly felt different. Not just decorations, but memories, each one representing a moment in someone's life. Leo pointed toward a faded blue sticker near the top. "What about that one?" Daniel leaned closer and adjusted his glasses. "Ah," he said quietly. "That one is from Lisbon." He smiled gently. That was a very important trip. Leo waited. Daniel seemed to drift into memory for a moment. "I was 30 years old," Daniel said. "I had just started my career as a journalist. My editor sent me to Portugal to write about the old neighborhoods near the river." Leo imagined the scene. Narrow streets, colorful buildings, warm sunlight. "But something unexpected happened," Daniel continued. "What happened?" Leo asked. Daniel smiled slightly. "I got lost." Leo laughed. "That happens to travelers all the time." Daniel nodded. "Yes. But getting lost is often how the best stories begin." Leo liked that idea. "What happened when you got lost?" Daniel pointed to the Lisbon sticker. "I wandered into a small cafe on a quiet street. It wasn't a tourist place. It was just a local cafe where neighbors gathered every afternoon." Leo could almost see it. Small wooden tables, the smell of coffee, soft conversation in Portuguese. "And that's where I met Maria," Daniel said. "Maria?" Leo asked, and Daniel nodded. "She was the owner of the cafe." Leo leaned forward. "Was she the story you wrote about?" Daniel smiled. "No. She became something much more important than that." Leo looked confused. "What do you mean?" Daniel rested his hands on the suitcase again. "Maria taught me something that changed the way I traveled forever." Leo waited patiently. What was it? He asked. Daniel looked around the busy station for a moment. Then he said quietly, "She told me that most travelers see the world, but very few actually listen to it." Leo blinked. "Listen?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. Listen to the people, their lives, their stories." Leo sat silently. That sentence stayed in his mind because it sounded simple, but also very powerful. Daniel continued, "After meeting Maria, I stopped traveling like a tourist. I started traveling like a listener." Leo smiled. "That's a beautiful way to see the world." Daniel nodded slowly. "And this suitcase?" He tapped it gently. "Is full of those stories." Leo looked at the suitcase again. Now it felt less like luggage and more like a library. Just then, the station speaker made another announcement. Leo glanced up at the board. His train had been delayed. He turned back to Daniel. "Well," Leo said with a smile, "it looks like I have time to hear another story." Daniel chuckled. "I suppose you do." Leo pointed toward another sticker, a bright red one near the corner. "What about that one?" Daniel leaned closer. His smile grew wider. "That one," he said, "is from Japan. And that story begins on a train even more interesting than this one." Daniel adjusted his glasses and looked at the red sticker again. "Tokyo," he said softly. "That was one of the most unusual trips of my life." Leo leaned back on the bench but kept his attention completely focused on Daniel. "What happened there?" he asked. Daniel rested his hands on the suitcase again. "I traveled to Japan many years after my trip to Lisbon," he said. "By that time, I had already visited many countries. I had written dozens of articles. But Japan was different." "How so?" Leo asked. Daniel smiled slightly. "Everything there felt precise, organized, quiet." Leo nodded. "That sounds like what people always say about Japan." Daniel chuckled. "Yes. But what surprised me most was the train system." Leo laughed. "Why?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Because the trains arrived exactly on time. Not 1 minute late." Leo laughed again. "That would surprise people in many countries." Daniel nodded. "I remember standing on a platform in Tokyo watching the clock. The train was scheduled to arrive at 2:14 p.m. Leo smiled. "Let me guess. It arrived at exactly 2:14. Daniel smiled. "Not just exactly. The train doors opened at exactly the same second." Leo shook his head. "That's incredible." Daniel continued. "I boarded the train and found my seat. It was a long ride through the countryside." Leo imagined the scene. Fast trains moving through quiet landscapes, mountains, small towns, rice fields. Daniel looked thoughtful. "I remember feeling tired that day. I had been traveling for several weeks, so I planned to rest during the journey." Leo nodded. "That makes sense." "But something unexpected happened," Daniel said. Leo leaned forward again. "What?" Daniel smiled gently. "I noticed a young boy sitting across the aisle." Leo looked curious. "How old was he?" "Maybe 12, Daniel said. He wore a school uniform and carried a small backpack. Leo pictured the boy, quiet, sitting properly in his seat. What was unusual about him? Leo asked. Daniel pointed to the imaginary space in front of him. He had a notebook. Leo smiled. That's not unusual. Daniel shook his head. It was what he was doing with the notebook. Leo waited. He was drawing every passenger on the train, Daniel explained. Leo laughed softly. Really? Daniel nodded. Yes. I watched him quietly for almost an hour. Leo imagined the boy carefully sketching each person. How good were the drawings? Leo asked. Daniel smiled. Very good. But that wasn't what impressed me the most. What was it? Leo asked. Daniel looked thoughtful again. The boy drew people with incredible attention. He studied their expressions, the way they sat, the way they held their hands. Leo nodded slowly. He was observing people. Exactly, Daniel said. Leo smiled. That sounds like what you do when you collect stories. Daniel pointed at Leo. Exactly. Leo laughed. So what happened next? Daniel leaned back slightly. Eventually, the boy looked up and noticed me watching him. Leo grinned. Was he embarrassed? Daniel shook his head. No. He smiled, and then he walked over to me. Leo raised his eyebrows. He approached a stranger? Daniel nodded. Yes. He showed me the drawing he had made of me. Leo laughed. What did it look like? Daniel chuckled. Surprisingly accurate. Leo smiled. So what did you say to him? Daniel thought for a moment. I told him he was very talented. Leo nodded. That's a good thing to say. Daniel continued. But then he told me something that stayed with me for years. Leo leaned forward again. What did he say? Daniel smiled. He said, if you watch people carefully, you can understand their stories. Leo sat silently. That sentence sounded very familiar, almost the same lesson Maria had taught Daniel years earlier. Listening, observing, understanding people. Leo shook his head slowly. That's amazing. Daniel nodded. Yes. It reminded me that wisdom can come from anyone. Leo looked down at the suitcase again. Even a 12-year-old artist on a train. Daniel smiled. Exactly. Just then, another announcement echoed through the station. Leo glanced up again. His train was now arriving in 10 minutes. He looked back at Daniel. I'm really glad my train was delayed, Leo said. Daniel chuckled softly. Travel delays sometimes create the best conversations. Leo nodded. Then he pointed toward another sticker on the suitcase. This one showed a bright green mountain landscape. Where is that one from? Leo asked. Daniel looked down at the sticker. His expression changed slightly. That one, he said slowly. It's from Peru. Leo raised his eyebrows. South America? Daniel nodded. Yes. And that story, he smiled thoughtfully, began at sunrise high in the mountains. Daniel ran his fingers gently over the green sticker. Peru, he repeated quietly. That trip happened many years after the others. Leo leaned forward with interest. What were you doing there? Daniel smiled. My editor sent me to write about the mountains, the Andes. Leo nodded. I've seen pictures of those mountains. They look incredible. Daniel nodded slowly. They are. But what made that trip unforgettable had nothing to do with the mountains. Leo smiled. Of course it didn't. Daniel chuckled. You're starting to understand how travel really works. Leo laughed. So what happened? Daniel looked up as if he were remembering the morning clearly. I arrived in a small mountain village before sunrise. The air was cold, very cold. Leo imagined the scene. Thin mountain air, dark sky slowly turning blue, small stone houses sitting quietly in the valley. There were only a few people awake, Daniel continued. A baker opening his shop, a woman carrying water, and a man sitting on a wooden chair outside his house. Leo tilted his head. What was he doing? Daniel smiled. Nothing. Leo blinked. Nothing? Daniel nodded. He was simply sitting there watching the sun rise. Leo laughed softly. That sounds peaceful. Daniel nodded. It was. I decided to sit nearby and take some photographs. Leo imagined Daniel setting up his camera, the early morning light slowly spreading across the mountains. What happened next? Leo asked. Daniel smiled. The man noticed me. Leo waited. He waved and invited me to sit beside him. Leo grinned. That seems friendly. Daniel nodded. People in small villages are often very welcoming. Leo leaned forward. So you talked? Daniel nodded. Yes, but slowly. His English was limited, and my Spanish was not very strong at the time. Leo laughed. So how did you communicate? Daniel smiled. Simple words, gestures, and patience. Leo nodded. That works surprisingly well sometimes. Daniel continued. We sat there for almost an hour watching the sun rise over the mountains. Leo imagined the golden light slowly appearing, the peaks turning bright, the valley warming with sunlight. That sounds like a beautiful moment, Leo said. Daniel nodded. It was. Finally, I asked him a question. Leo smiled. What did you ask? Daniel said quietly, I asked him if he ever wanted to travel. Leo tilted his head. That's a natural question for a travel journalist. Daniel nodded. Yes. But his answer surprised me. Leo waited. What did he say? Daniel smiled gently. He looked at the mountains. Then he looked at the village. And he said, why would I leave when everything I love is already here? Leo sat quietly for a moment. The station noise continued around them, but the sentence felt powerful. That's beautiful, Leo said softly. Daniel nodded. That man had never traveled far from his village. But he was one of the happiest people I had ever met. Leo looked at the suitcase again. So what did you learn from that trip? Daniel smiled. I learned that travel doesn't always mean moving. Leo frowned slightly. What do you mean? Daniel pointed toward Leo's camera bag. You traveled to capture the world through photographs. Leo nodded. Daniel tapped the suitcase. I traveled to collect stories. Leo waited. But that man in the mountains, Daniel said quietly, he didn't need to travel anywhere. Leo thought about that because it was true. Happiness can exist in a single place. Sometimes the world comes to you. Just then, the station speaker made another announcement. Leo's train had arrived. Passengers began moving toward the platform. Leo stood up slowly. Well, he said, I guess it's time for me to travel. Daniel smiled. Yes. But remember something. Leo waited. Daniel said gently, wherever you go, pay attention to the people. Leo nodded. I will. He hesitated for a moment. Then he asked, will that suitcase keep traveling? Daniel smiled. Maybe. But I think the best stories now belong to younger travelers. Leo picked up his camera bag. Then he smiled. Well, he said, I guess I'd better start collecting some stories. Daniel nodded approvingly. Leo walked toward the train platform, but before boarding, he looked back once more. Daniel sat quietly on the bench beside the old suitcase, watching the station, observing people, just like always. And Leo suddenly understood something. Every traveler carries a suitcase, but the most valuable thing inside is the stories we collect along the way. Vocabulary review. Journalist. A person who writes news stories or articles for newspapers or magazines. Example, Daniel worked as a travel journalist. Observation. Carefully watching something to understand it. Example, good travelers learn through observation. Journey. A trip from one place to another. Example, Leo began his journey to the coast. Perspective, a way of thinking about something. Example, the man in the mountains had a different perspective on travel. Reflection. Question. Think about this. When you travel somewhere new, what do you usually notice first? The place or the people? Sometimes the most important stories are not about the destination, but about the conversations we have along the way. If you enjoyed this story, you can like the video, save it, and try listening to it again later. Listening regularly helps you become more comfortable with natural English, real conversations, and everyday expressions. Learning English is not only about building vocabulary, it's also about understanding ideas, experiences, and stories through language. Play the lesson one more time and notice how much easier it feels. Until next time, this is English Listening with Mai. Listen more, understand more,